Welcome to Vision Chats, where the only thing that matters is the future. I'm Farouk Day, Vice Provost at Johns Hopkins University, and I decided today to talk about higher education, the future of the university, and where we're headed in the future. And I could not think of a better leader to invite to this conversation with us today. Please join me to welcome Chancellor Marks, Chancellor of the University of Colorado, Denver. Hi, Michelle.
Hi, Farouk. It's so great to be here with you today.
Thank you so much for accepting my invitation. I have so many questions for you, but first, let me tell our audience about you a little bit. Michelle, you are a force to reckon with. You're an award-winning leader in higher education, a scholar, and a professor in business and organizational management. You served previously as the vice president for academic innovation and new ventures, and also prior to that, vice provost of academic affairs at George Mason University. And you had the interesting fortune, I'm not sure if it's good or bad, to start your first chancellorship in summer of 2020. I don't know what was going on around that time, probably a global pandemic. And this could have been either the best time or the worst time to start such an important leadership role. Would love to hear from you how that went for you, and as you look back through the back mirror, and what lessons have come out of that experience. Must have been really interesting.
It was really interesting. I'll tell you, I accepted this role in March 2020, just before the country basically shut down. And I officially started the job on July 1st, 2020. And I think to myself so many times, if I had known in March 2020 that the pandemic would be as severe as it has been and lasted as long as it has, would I have chosen this moment to move across the country and start this role?
Mm-hmm.
It was a bit terrifying, quite frankly, because while I felt like I had a lot of experience in leadership and higher education, I had absolutely no experience in leading through a pandemic. And all of a sudden, I had the responsibility that was truly life or death on my hands. But in hindsight and reflection, I'm really glad that I took this role. First of all, my institution is terrific and amazing. And I think the pandemic has created opportunities to do things that might not have been possible if we weren't in such a world crisis. So it's been an incredibly difficult time, but I also think it's been a moment to create needed shift and change because disparities are on display.
Yeah, and I'm thinking of just higher education as its own field, as an industry that has been so anchored in tradition and often so resistant to change. Although it's been really challenging to start a chancellorship during that time, but also I would imagine that it created some opportunities to really make some headwinds for change during a time where people are more open to it because of this global pandemic that was disrupting every facet of how we run our universities and colleges. Was that the case for you?
I think it was. As I reflect back now over the last year and a half plus, I think the answer is a resounding yes. But it was hard to start a job. As a chancellor, you are in any kind of leadership position. You are creating relationships with students and faculty and staff and alumni and partners. And it's really hard to do that. I felt like I had a hand or two tied behind my back. I mean, most of the first year was on Zoom. And while this works great for reaching a national audience like we are today, that having a computer in the middle of conversations when I really wanted to be sitting across the table listening, it was hard. And yet we all took the tools we had and we figured out new ways of doing something and we forged ahead. And that's what we did.
So is that how you did your listening tour in your initial 100 days?
It was exactly how we did the listening tour. In fact, I should also start out by saying that in addition to COVID, I started this role a month after George Floyd was killed.
Yeah.
It was also the presidential election was happening in November of the year that I started. There was a ton of social unrest. When I arrived, there were all kinds of letters on my desk that talked about defunding the police and a lot of diversity, equity, and inclusion issues. So there were a handful of issues both at my university, but across that were evident of what was happening across the entire country that were front and center. So that was the only tool I had. I knew that I had to listen and know a lot more. Zoom was the only tool I had at the time. So I spent the first 10 days doing a listening tour exclusively focused on racial justice issues. And then the rest of the 90 days were any issue anybody wanted to raise. And a lot of those issues, again, focused in that area as well. And I could not have done this job without understanding our community.
Mhm. That I applaud you for that. And I was going to ask, how does a leader manage all of that? All of this feedback and all of these demands, and they come on the spectrum. What do you do with all of that input and all of that data that you gather? Certainly, I mean, I can understand that comforting the people you're listening to and allowing them to feel heard is one piece of it, but then it stops at some point at that and starts with some action. How do you move beyond that listening?
Well, you're absolutely right, because especially at that moment in the country, it was people were listening is not enough. People expecting and needed to have action. I did need to listen though before we acted. I brought somebody into the meetings with me to take notes and make sure that we, number one, created a community where people could comfortably express their feelings. And there were a lot of feelings, a lot of anger, a lot of anxiety in what was happening in America and in our community. And so I listened, and then we created notes from the sessions that weren't attributable to individuals, so that I had a chance to reflect and review. And after 100 days, there were themes that emerged. I actually wrote a report to my community afterwards and sent it around to show that not only had I listened and heard, but I reported back on the themes that were expressed. And as it turns out, those themes began the basis of a process to create a new strategic plan for our university, which we could not have run such a community-driven process had we not heard from the community at the front end.
It really sounds like that was the foundation for your strategic plan. I read about it that I think it lasted about 6 months, and you've collected about 7,000 ideas, probably more than that. And you had full community involvement. And having been in higher ed now for a while, I know that you don't just create that. Like that really starts with that process of listening that you've certainly invested in. And you could tell that those themes around diversity and equity and inclusion that came up in your first 100 days really showed up in your strategic plan. So ultimately, you ended up with this grand vision with a tagline of education that works for all. And I read about it that it was described as being about transforming lives, expanding economies, and uplifting communities, all with a theme that it's for everybody, not just for the few or for the ones who are so lucky or fortunate to take advantage of it. So clearly, equity was at the core of your vision. What does this mean for you, and for your community, and for CU Denver, the vision that you all have come up with, and then the strategic plan?
I think that equity is a key theme of the strategic plan. And what it means is that a zip code that you're born into, or that your financial position in life should not determine, or your race or your ethnicity should not determine your success in college and and the opportunities that you have in your career and in your life. And the reality is, our higher education system in America started off serving the privileged few. And over the last few hundred years, that has changed, and there's been lots of efforts to expand access to higher education. But today's reality is that there are still too few people in America getting into and getting through college from more diverse backgrounds and more diverse and from lower socioeconomic status. So we have to do more, and our institution, as the only urban public research university in the state of Colorado, we need to lead that effort.
Yeah, and what that means is opening access so that it's at the forefront. You have more students of lower income backgrounds who are first to go to college in their families, students of color, all of the marginalized group to have more access, but then also that they persist, that they graduate on time, that they're successful. And then I think, in my opinion, where a lot of universities perhaps don't put enough prioritization around this is what they do after. Is how do we ensure that they also have a good off ramp into the world of work, and then they are just as successful regardless of their background or social capital. I was reading in the Chronicle that the Biden administration is looking to double the maximum Pell Grant, and I wonder what difference that would make for colleges like yours or others.
I mean, it would make a tremendous difference. It's the difference between $6,500 versus $13,000 to go towards tuition. And as you can imagine, that would cover the cost of tuition for universities like mine and so many others. Affordability is one of several key reasons why we have access challenges, and the student loan system in America has there's been a lot of criticism around it. You can agree or disagree with that, but creating affordability for so many more students that either don't have the possibility of attending college or who don't see themselves as having the possibility of attending college, it would make a tremendous difference.
I think so too, and I would hope that if that happens, that universities would also invest the resources necessary for those students to be successful academically and socially, and are taking advantage of all of the resources available to them. And then again, just off ramp to really great careers after that. One study that I know we did at Johns Hopkins initially when I first started there showed us that the career outcomes after graduation were not similar or equitable across the board for our graduates, that you are less likely to earn the same income, to have the careers or jobs of choice, or to go to graduate schools of choice if you come from a lower income background or for first generation background.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think a lot about that. I think that's right. And one of there are probably a number of reasons for that. One of them is social capital, and
Yeah.
having parents who haven't necessarily, half of our students are first generation in their family to go to college. We're super proud of that. When you have parents who are college educated, you are more likely to have access to networks at various stages to help getting that internship, that summer internship. And I like to say there are students that, our students have tons of talent, but they don't have the same experience with opportunity. And so one of the things that colleges need to become stronger in is creating opportunities to have work-based experiences, whether they're internships or co-ops or working with entrepreneurs or research experiences that give them opportunities to build work experiences in areas that they might not have been exposed to, but also to find mentors and to create social capital that can be helpful to them as they transition from college into their first job.
So and that narrative, I think, is really popular, and you see it in scholarly work and in articles and Chronicle, and then there are a few institutions that implement it. From my vantage point, I still don't see a lot of universities truly prioritize it in an organizational way, that there is an element of the chancellor's board or the university organizational structure that really emphasizes that area of experiential learning and mentoring, and make it part of the curriculum. Why is that so challenging for higher education to really take in and to prioritize and to say that this is something we're going to integrate into the academic experience?
Well, as you and I both know, universities are very decentralized, and
Yeah.
so influencing curriculum in the way that is faculty led, and frankly, it's very distributed. I will say that universities typically have a lot of this going on, but creating something that is more standardized across an institution is challenging. CU Denver, it's a value that we have here, and actually from the listening tour and hearing from a lot of our alumni and what mattered to them, and what they took from their education that was most valuable. So many spoke of particular relationships with faculty and staff. So many others talked about the internship or that work-based experience that they were able to have. And we've actually incorporated it in our plan that every single graduate will have that experiential learning. And now we're working to incorporate that. And because it was a community-driven plan, people are bought in. So I think it takes buy-in from the entire community and shifting the way that things are done, but I'm confident that we're going to get there.
I agree with you, and I think I'll share with you, Michelle, that also what I've experienced is that there's a little bit of a pushback from, I would say, the academic side of the house. From some of our faculty friends, who I think absolutely have the right arguments, but I'm not sure if there's full buy-in to that idea, because there's resistance to what is called the vocationalization of higher education, and wanting to sort of keep it at a higher value. And anytime we try to bring in either work skills or work preparation or integration of experiential learning, but sometimes that gets challenged. I'm talking in general terms. I mean, I know we at Johns Hopkins, we're finding ways to work with that and still do really well. But I've seen it for a long time in higher education.
Yeah.
That's part of the challenge. I don't know if you remember this study that was done by Gallup in 2014 that surveyed academic leaders, and also surveyed business leaders about how they think college graduates are prepared for the workforce. 11% of business leaders thought that college graduates are workforce ready. 96% of academic leaders, that's provosts and presidents, felt that they were ready. The gap was just astonishing. So I wonder if you have thoughts about that.
Well, first of all, yes, I've seen that, and actually many other studies. Strata's done some interesting research in that space, and again, my path has been as a professor, and I've been on the frustrated end of that. I will say, though, it is time for a conversation, and let me just share a trend I've seen. This trend has become exacerbated in the pandemic. It's the conversation around how employers are literally resetting degree requirements in so many roles in their companies. And there is new data out to show that even over the pandemic, how many jobs, actually how many employers have dropped the degree requirement, especially in middle skill jobs, also in some high skill jobs. And I like to say in Colorado, 75% of jobs require college. So college is really important, but the reality is colleges need to do a better job of listening to what employers are feeling. First of all, we're criticized as being too slow and less relevant, as you spoke about, and too expensive. And the desperation that employers are going through right now for talent is exacerbating this. So what does this mean for us? It means that universities are going to have to get more skill-based in their approach, whether that happens within degrees, or whether that happens outside of degrees. Right now, when you're a college graduate, you end up with a major, you end up with a set of courses, you end up with a GPA, and that counts for something. That serves as a proxy for having knowledge and having soft skills. But there's a big shift going on where we're going to need to do a better job of creating skill-based job seekers, and I believe educators are going to have to do a much better job of documenting the competencies that our students are learning and enabling them to share that with prospective employers.
I'm wondering if we're finally starting to enter into the unbundling of college education era. And as micro-credentialing takes over, as we're seeing the rise of universities that focus on competency-based learning models, online learning is certainly taking over in many of these contexts. So when I look at universities like Southern New Hampshire University that has gone, the rise of that university alone in the last 20 years from 3,000 students to over 100,000 students, and certainly serving a more of an adult population, but still I think aligns with the new focus from employers on skills rather than degrees. Arizona State University online. We're starting to, Indiana. We're starting to see other public universities that are really entering to this game. Here in Maryland, we have UMGC, University of
Yep.
Maryland Global Campus. So what's your read on that? I mean, is this where higher education is going, is towards micro credentialing and bundling degrees, focusing on skills and competency based, really making it more about workforce? Or are we gonna, is the pendulum gonna swing back towards traditional higher education, or maybe somewhere in between?
Well, I think the pendulum is not going to swing back fully. I mean, our job, first of all, employers this trend was starting before COVID of skill-based hiring, and now it's moving even faster as companies like Google and IBM evaluate all of their jobs, and they're focusing more on competencies. It's going to be a hard shift for universities to make. And I don't think all of them are going to make them. I think, many universities, the most elite universities will probably do nothing different, and arguably, and I don't know what Johns Hopkins is going to do. So I'll certainly an elite university. But when I think about the learners that we're so proud to serve, half of our undergraduates are students of color, 70% of our learners are working and going to school at the same time and are super
Oh,
career focused. I think it's a huge advantage to our learners to be able to understand and to be able to that they're getting career relevant competencies as part of their learning. I think the big focus and the turnoff for institutions sometimes is that it's typically thought of like on the hard skills, like the technical skills.
yeah.
And in some ways, those are the easiest to measure. The soft skills, people get hired oftentimes in their first job for their hard skills, and they typically get fired for the lack of their, I like to call them essential skills. Some people call them soft
That's
skills.
true.
Writing, critical thinking, problem solving. So in my mind, how do we ensure that our learners, whether it's wrapped into a whole degree or whether it's in stackable, unbundled credentials or some combination or credit or non-credit, how do we ensure that they have the skills that are equip them not only for a successful first job, but for successful lives and careers and contributions to society?
Yeah, and I think that ultimately it's enrollment that's going to drive this change. And we're experiencing a national trend now. I don't know if it'll persist or not, of a drop in enrollments, according to the Student Clearinghouse, National Student Clearinghouse. They reported the 4% drop in enrollment among four-year public universities, 3% drop among private universities, 14.8, almost 15% among community colleges, and almost 11% among for-profit universities. So I'm actually scratching my head on this one. Why the drop? I mean, and what has happened that's causing people to hit the pause button? Is it going to be permanent or temporary? What do we do about it?
Well, it is absolutely true that there's this, if you look at birth rates, that there we'll be experiencing a demographic cliff as high school graduates across the country, I believe, are projected to decline after 2025. But look, there are tens of millions of people in the United States with some college and no degree. And these are opportunities. And I think there's 800,000 individuals in Colorado alone with some college and no degree. So I think if one of the ways that we're thinking about this is that the traditional college student, the person that goes to school between high school and a first job, that model, which is the model that a lot of institutions have focused on, we need to have many more models, and colleges need to differentiate. And an institution like mine, our goal number 2 of our strategic plan is to be a university for life and be a learning partner across, we say, from 17 to 117. Learning and careers are taking dramatically different paths. And so thinking about how a learner accesses education when they need it, as they need it, at different points in their career, And that's our differentiating strategy. I think if you're the, excuse me, the type of institution that is focusing in on a narrow mold of students, it's going to be challenging to compete for that student as there become fewer of them over time.
And the mode of learning, I think, also has an impact. And that, I know the first year of the pandemic, we were all forced into online learning. And I say forced because many of us didn't want to.
Yeah.
We resisted that, and then at first, I don't think we did it well, and then we got better, and then got better, and then as the pandemic eased, we started to sort of come back into hybrid learning. What I'm reading now is that some universities are actually doing away with hybrid, want to go back to fully residential. Others are completely embracing the online learning and moving forward with that they have found new paths. The Chronicle reported recently that there are some colleges that are ending hybrid learning, and students are pushing back. And it's really hard to also read where students want to be. You read about students wanting to come back to residential campuses and they miss the experience and the community. But then also you read about students who want hybrid or also want online. What's the right model? I mean, I think that's probably one of the conundrum here. Like, that's the challenge.
Yeah. I spent a lot of, in my career, I spent a lot of time thinking about
Right.
that question. I think it's exactly the right question to be asking right now. And actually, one of the opportunities that I think that's emerged from the pandemic is that because of this forced virtual learning, which wasn't right for everybody, but it's what we had available, many more faculty members taught in this mode. And in some institutions like ours, we were able to provide faculty development in the space so that faculty members that were less comfortable across the country in this mode now are, in fact, in some cases, bringing people back from that mode has been onto campus has been difficult in some colleges across the country. I think the best model is that we have different models across the country, because the reality is, and this is a tagline that we're using at CU Denver, one size fits one, is that we need different kinds of education and different kinds of modalities to fit the lives of our students as opposed to the other way around. And the institutions that you mentioned a few minutes ago, UMGC, University of Maryland Global Campus, we have Colorado State Global and here in Colorado. Those are two examples of fully online, or mostly are fully online institutions. There are other campuses, as you mentioned, that are going back to fully on ground, and that's a model that works for many. For our campus, we learned a lot over the pandemic, and the model that we're moving to is I don't know if hybrid is the right word, but we need to be multimodal. We've been carefully watching what's happened with so many of our students and who's succeeding and who's challenged. And for us, we're thinking about, at universities that tend to do both have an experience for fully online students and a very separate experience for students in the classroom. And for our students, we now are thinking about how we do seamless integration across learning environments so that we offer all students the same strong learning environment, no matter what modality, no matter if they want to have both modalities within a semester or go back and forth.
Yeah, there's just so many opportunities to really do this right, but I also think that there are even more opportunities to do it wrong, and to not take advantage of just the all of the learning that we've had the last couple of years. So part of this this debate of in-person, hybrid, and online also extends to our own employees and workforce within higher education. And we're not immune to the great resignation. Every industry is experiencing it. And I'm sure you've been thinking a lot about it. So what's happening right now in the workforce of higher education? And how are we treating our own employees, faculty, and staff, and how do we move forward? And what is the right model to employ and to hire and to create healthy workforce cultures?
Well, I'm going to share some of my thoughts about the future of work, and then I'm going to ask you to do the same, because I know this area of expertise and interest that I've heard you speak on. And frankly, a lot of what we're doing, we've learned from you in your work as we think about designing careers and lives into the future. But this is one of the great learnings, I think, through the pandemic, as we took our workers, and most of them worked for a period of time virtually. And now we're thinking, okay, what is the model that we need to go forward? We can think of this from the perspective of how do you attract and retain workers into the future? I mean, we're a large employer, as well as a talent pipeline provider of our students and our graduates. We're also a large employer and experience the same thing that everybody else. So how do we create jobs for the future? How do we structure them? How do we think about, our goal number 5 is become a best place to work. What does that mean these days? Certainly it means including more flexibility, understanding and incorporating aspects of what it means to create jobs that allow for personal development and what does it mean, and also creating community. I mean, so when we were all connecting through Zoom, we missed out on that conversation that just happens naturally in the hallway, or that mode of support. So we're revising telework policies. We're thinking about how we can use time in the office to be together, and how we need to support students, and what has to be done on campus, and how we can allow more flexibility. And rather than be a 9 to 5 during the week operation, how can we involve work to get done to support students when our students need that support, and how we can use technology differently. So much is going into this conversation right now. And I'm going to throw the question right back at you and have you share how you're thinking. I mean, how can we incorporate design into the principles of work for the future?
Well, I so appreciate your answer, and I'll add from my vantage point that and my disclaimer is that I'm painting broad strokes here, so there are exceptions to everything that we say. That in general terms, managers of the workforce want employees back to be in person most of the time, if not all of the time. And in general terms, employees on the other side want flexibility. And the younger they are, the more flexibility they want. They're not saying we want to work from home. They're saying we want flexibility. I want to decide when to come to work in person and when to do my work at home or remotely. And we're seeing right now sort of like this friction point. And the big companies that we're hearing about are putting their foot down and saying, we're going to set the standard. The problem is that right now employees have the power. So you're hearing of announcements like Google and Apple and, almost the entire Silicon Valley that professed work from home or remote work at first as the way of the future is now resisting and saying, we want you back. So there is a friction point there to try to address, but it really is about power. What I'm also saying is that eventually the pendulum is going to swing back. And I think it'll swing back sooner than we think, because the economy is going through rapid changes right now. At some point, we will hit a recession. At some point, the job market is going to tighten up, and the employees won't have that power anymore. Where we move forward. So what we know now is that the majority of jobs that are out there, let me rephrase that the percentage of jobs that are remote has increased exponentially in the last couple of years. For college graduates specifically, it increased by about 500% in the last 2 years, by 1,300% in the last 5 years. Those are huge shifts. For the general worker population, it has also increased by around 700%. What that tells us is that employees have choices. So if they don't like the work mode that you give them, they have the opportunity to go elsewhere and get what they want. The way I think we should move forward, in my opinion, is that we build this based on the desired outcomes rather than the desired processes. So it's less about the missing the water cooler conversation, and it's a lot more about what outcomes you want to get by the end of the year for each of the different businesses or units that we have, and for the entire organization, and how do we achieve that. And what that will create is flexibility overall. So for some units, there is no choice. They have to be in person because that's the only way they're going to achieve those business outcomes. For others, I think it's okay to do it in person, because we will to do online, because we can achieve those outcomes easily that way. So I will tell you that I have units in my division that are fully online, and we started them that way, fully remote, or remote first. And we started them that way before the pandemic. They were conceived that way because they were driven by desired outcomes. I have an entire data team that works entirely remotely. And therefore, I have, we hire somebody from Kansas City and somebody from, but we have people working from Florida, because we're really driven by outcomes for those things. But we have other units that need to be front facing with students and with our constituents, and need to be on campus more often. I feel like that's really eventually going to be the solution. The last thing I'll just share, which I'm sure you're thinking about, is our responsibility as institutions to the towns and communities around us. When we send everybody to remote, the businesses around us suffer. The food trucks and the restaurants and the Uber drivers and Lyft drivers, et cetera. And I'm sure that that's been part of your conversation too, is what is your responsibility to the Denver community? And that's why it can't be just one size fits all for those.
Yeah, it's interesting having a campus right in the middle of Denver. We're deeply connected with our community, and we've just been meeting recently with the mayor and something we call the Downtown Denver Partnership, and employers and public safety and other educational institutions. And we're working together to think about what the future of a city looks like. Restaurants are back, people are living in the city, our students are back, but employees in a lot of are not fully back. In fact, the last statistics I saw in Denver is that about 30% of employees are working from the office every day. And
Yeah.
it's a question of, I think we're in for a new moment. I don't know that people are going to be willing to be commuting in the same way that they were in the past. So you're right, designing around the outcomes that are needed, but also thinking about the impact. Universities have very large infrastructure. We have large ground games. We have lots of buildings. And so we're also having the conversation of, if we have more hybrid teleworking in the future that makes sense for business, for university outcomes, what does that mean? Does that open up other opportunities for us to use space in
Right.
different ways?
I love that, and I want to comment some more about that. I think this is an opportunity for us to reimagine our physical spaces. What employees, I think, one of the parts that make employees really cringe about going back to the office is how we set up our offices. The leaders and the C-suite people have all of the offices and with views and corner windows, and it feels like there's just such a power dynamic there, and then everybody else is in the cubicle being watched and looked at. But really, the office of the future is that it's really open. You come and work anywhere you want in there. You show up, you decide on your schedule. So there's flexibility. You come on some days, and some days you work in other places on campus. And I'm happy to share with you that we designed such a space. It's called the Imagine Center for Integrative Learning and Life Design at Johns Hopkins, which will open in 2 months. And we started that design before the pandemic. And we created it that way, that it's not really about creating offices and cubicles. It's really to open spaces for people to create, innovate, have those random conversations. And we're not checking when people show up and, punch in and punch out. And I think that's probably going to be the work of the environment of the future, is that it's truly hybrid and the physical spaces mirror that. So universities have a lot to do in terms of knocking down walls and reconfiguring their spaces.
We do, and a lot of our buildings have been around for a long time, and when you walk in there, are hallways full of offices. If you look at what's happened to libraries on campus, it's an interesting example. Libraries, when I went to college way back then, what was the place where you would go and you'd use the card catalog, and it was a quiet space where you would find journals or books. And now so much is accessible online, and so libraries have been shifting to use less space for traditional books and journals and materials, and more space for becoming collaboration hubs. And some of them have tea shops, and how do we bring people together? We're in the process of building a new engineering and computing building, and I want that building to feel like the future of education, which is thinking about partnerships and collaboration spaces and how we make all of our students feel like they belong in that space. Very different from the old model of hallways and classrooms and offices.
Yeah, and coincidentally, that aligns with the ultimate vision for, I know your university, but for higher education, which is to create more equity and inclusion. If you don't mind, I want to go back to what we started with, the conversation around social justice and the role of the university in that. And I know that marked the start of your chancellorship at CU Denver, given the social justice environment at that time. Um, there's been quite a bit of debate of the role of the university in such conversations, and there are people on all sides trying to really cover it. Some putting the responsibility on the university to advance that movement and to advance those conversations, and then others are talking about it from perspective of freedom of speech. And so it's really complex, and I wonder where you have landed on that. Of what is the role of a university in helping society move through such important conversations, and also to helping society address these issues.
Well, I think there's a lot in that question. Let me take a part of it.
Sure.
I think that despite a ton of focus in higher education on the value of social mobility, and I don't know anybody in any of my colleagues who have my jobs at other institutions who wouldn't say that they believe in the value of addressing social justice um, and equity issues in society, and believing that higher education is an important vehicle for that. In fact, we're #1 in social mobility in Colorado and proud of it. But despite all of the effort that's gone in, it is still true that the percentage of students from low-income families hasn't who getting college degrees hasn't risen in 20 years. And by the way, the percentage of the top 50% of families in that income bracket has continued to increase. It's something like 6 out of 10 25-year-olds who are raised in families in upper income distributions have their degree, and compared to like 40% of those in middle income, compared to like 10% of those in the bottom 40. So are we okay with that as a society? If you're okay with that, then we, keep going, let's keep going. But if we're not okay with that, the question is, what do we need to do about it to make that change? And I think the answer is we need to invest in serving those with the least. And that means a lot of things. That means creating more scholarships and more wraparound supports, and making things more simple, and having pre-college coaching, and thinking about ecosystems between middle school and high school and college and career, which you've worked in particular. So I think from that aspect of it, we need to rethink college to be able to support more students and ensure their ability to succeed, ensure that they've got the preparation to succeed, ensure that they've got the support to succeed, and the confidence that they can do it. So that may have not been the full question that you asked, but I'm a staunch believer in taking on this mission and making all students feel like they can belong and succeed. And that means redoing the way that we operate.
I know part of that is for the university to employ people that represent the diversity of our students. So for our students to feel that they belong, that they actually see themselves in not only the leadership of the university in all of its levels, but also its faculty and its staff. And that's a challenge right now in higher education. I mean, as you look at the pyramid, and you climb up in the organization, it becomes less and less diverse. I mean, I think I read somewhere that 28% of women in higher education believe they were not promoted because of their gender, for example. And we see that in a variety of categories. What do you think of that challenge? But also, more importantly, how do we tackle it so that we are as diverse as we profess to want to be, or to want to create as an environment?
We have to do better. And I'll tell you, when I walked into this institution, there were no people of color on the cabinet. I'm proud to say that in the last year, 5 out of 8 hires I've made are people of color, and we look different now. And by the way, everybody's watching. Everybody's watching leadership. So you can't ask something of an institution unless you're leading by example. We're setting goals and shifting. We have an incredibly diverse student body that resembles the changing demographics in Denver and our surrounding area, but our faculty and staff, we have a lot of work to do. And the challenge is that pretty much every college that I know in America has the same challenge. One of the ways that I know that I'm working with fellow university leaders is to, I think for the first time, work together. So we're emerging Hispanic serving institution, and there's a new network of Hispanic serving institutions that are R1 that are working together to think about the future of the professoriate and see whether we can create pathways across our students from undergraduate to graduate school to the professoriate. And I don't know that there's ever been that kind of connectivity, because we're all recognizing that we need to be a part of the solution. And there needs to be a lot more work in this space that starts early, and we all have to be prepared to do it.
I think so. It just feels so difficult. I know that's something that we're really trying to tackle at Johns Hopkins too, and we've been, I think almost every university out there has its own roadmap to diversity and equity and inclusion. But also almost every company or just the workforce out there is trying to get there. But it feels that for the most part, and I'm really happy to hear that you're making this progress at CU Denver, but for a large part, it feels like it stops at hiring the diversity, equity, and inclusion officer and giving them a really high bar goals to achieve, and often less support. And typically, those people don't stay more beyond 2 or 3 years, and it feels like the never-ending cycle. So I personally, as somebody who's watching this and also work in this environment, sometimes just wonder how we can ever get to a better place.
Well, we have a lot of work to do, but I do have some optimism. There are practices that are working in some places. So for example, there's a search advocate program, and I don't know if it was Berkeley, it was started out of one of the California schools, where and we're doing work with them. It's a program that trains faculty and staff to sit on search committees to
Yeah,
share practices that work in searches. Searches are where the action happens.
that's right.
And setting up a search and a search committee can mean a great deal in terms of the pool that you bring in for talent. And so that's one concrete step that we've taken, is that we're bringing in this search advocate practice. Right now, we're starting with what we can do, but I'm hoping that that's a practice that we can at some point in the future have in all of our searches. There are a handful of practices that we've identified that are things that we need to do differently at this institution. And I think it's something that at least what I've seen in the last few years is universities are taking, that it's front and center, and it should be, it needs to be.
Mhm. Yeah, I hope so. I mean, I think I have hope. I also heard and read that the cluster hiring model for faculty seems to work too, where you have sort of an interdisciplinary approach, and you try to create these new positions that have connections with different academic disciplines and departments, and allows you to have a much more diverse pool. And also, it creates sort of more pressure on the hiring entities to have more diverse or appropriate practices of hiring. I know it has produced results for many universities.
It has. It has. One of the challenges, the rankings is always an interesting conversation to have. I like to say that we don't care about rankings, except for that when we show up well in the rankings, I like to share them. And
Yeah.
but there have been colleges in America that are so exclusively focused on rankings that effectively they're becoming even more selective. And the impact of that is that they're less accessible to a more diverse student body. And we need to get more of America into and through college and through graduate school if we are going to fulfill our aspirations of having a professoriate and that resembles our student body and our emerging demographics in America.
I'm so glad you said that. I think there was just a piece in the Chronicle today or yesterday that questioned the value of some of the factors that are in the rankings. And I've always wondered what's a better admission rate? Is it a 4% admission rate or 100% admission rate?
Well, um, there are different kinds of universities. If you look at the community
Right.
college system across, I'm a big fan. I've done work in transfer. Half of our students are transfer students here, and in my past work, I've been a huge advocate of strengthening transfer pathways. That community colleges are one of our nation's systems for creating geographical access and financial access to higher education. The challenge is that the leaky pipeline between those who begin at community colleges and those who actually get over to four-year institutions, and then those who graduate from there is a real challenge. And so I think, and community colleges again are out in the geographic areas, and they have some of our most diverse student populations. So there's a lot that we need to work on as a system of higher education to ensure that all students have the kind of support they need to be successful, whether it's starting in community colleges, which have 100% acceptance rate, or whether it's getting students into institutions that are more selective. I do have I would like to see more super selective institutions value having more diversity in their student body.
Mhm. Yeah, I agree. And philanthropy is a huge part of that. I think. Um, so as we enter into the last few minutes of our vision chats, I want to ask you about leadership advice from you, particularly leading through a period of major crisis like a global pandemic and social justice upheaval and starting a new job, a new leadership role. Well, what are some of the lessons learned from you that you wish somebody had taught you early on in your career?
Well, I think the first one is around values and understanding your institution's values and understanding your personal values and staying close, getting cozy with your core values for sure. That's one of them, because oftentimes they're very difficult decisions to make. And when those come from a place of your institution's values, you cannot make the wrong decision. I would say that is one of them. The second thing is around failure. And I've certainly made my share of mistakes in this job and in others. I think creating a culture, especially right now, is so much change, as we've talked about a bunch of the areas where higher ed is changing or frankly needs to change. But I think the only way that we can change, and this is probably true of every organization, but higher ed isn't exactly known with its speed to change, is having a culture that accepts and tolerates failure. Because if we are going to become more entrepreneurial as a sector, we have to have an environment that allows for and supports risk-taking and creating new kinds of learning environments, risk-taking and designing, in designing new kinds of career models, and risk-taking and designing, the kinds of models that we're thinking about to be a best place to work for our employees. And we have to be willing to try things and look at data and see how they work. And I have found that when people are so afraid of making a mistake or failing, they're not willing to take risks. So I think a lot about how do I lead by showing that it's okay both for me to make mistakes and apologize and own up to it, but also for all of our employees to do the same.
Yeah, and I agree with that, and I think you as a chancellor, you create that environment that gives people the autonomy and the freedom to experiment and to take risks, and when they make mistakes, that there is room for them to recover. I watch just the national scene, not only in higher education but also in industry. I wonder if executive leaders are afforded that same level of grace, because they make mistakes also, and as you stated, you've made your own too. Um, and sometimes I worry that perhaps we are too quick to write off our leaders when they make a mistake, or gang up on them, or we just something we've read about leaders being pushed to resign, etc. So how do you as a chancellor create that environment that allows you personally to also take risks and to feel that sense of safety as you try and you fail sometimes?
It's a really good question, because I think in these kind of roles that are so public, um, it is probably true that making a big public mistake, sometimes you're not necessarily in control of what other people do or the way that they'll react.
Right.
But I think if you let that control your actions, you can't be courageous and you
Mhm.
can't make change. You're so busy being safe. And so I guess I have always thought of myself as somebody who is trying to do the right thing and understanding who our students are and what we, being driven by what we need to do to support our students and our employees and our community. And if and being willing to create change and create community around doing that. And I think it is true that other higher education leaders have are sometimes not afforded that opportunity, but I don't want to lead by being fearful, because I think that will stop the institution's progress. And there's a new kind of public education that we have to lead through, and so I'm out there doing it. We'll see what happens.
Well, they're certainly fortunate to have someone like you who leads with that mindset. I would love to ask you as well a final question about how your life turned into becoming a chancellor of a major university like CU Denver. So your own life design a little bit. What are the pivotal moments that led you to where you are today?
I never imagined this, really, even before winter of 2020. I was the kind of person, like so many, who, in college, I happened to have a professor who took me under her wing and ended up doing a research project with me, which I ended up publishing together. We published, and that led me to think about graduate school. And in graduate school, I thought I was going to go to an applied field, and a professor, I had to work my way through grad school, and a professor sitting in a class that I was teaching as a teaching assistant was making sure, I think, that the grad students didn't run amok, and ended up giving me feedback that pushed me towards being a faculty member. And as a
Mhm.
faculty member, I was leading study abroad, so with business students across the world. And we were studying international business and foreign investment, but the topics that our students really wanted to talk about, when we were in China, for example, and we would be in factories and it was 100 degrees and employers weren't wearing masks, and our students would be so frustrated at the working conditions, and then they would learn how 3 years in these factories would be able to elevate an entire family from Western China. And the dinner conversations became so culturally sensitive, and this would happen in Dubai as we were in the parking lot of Pakistanis building the tallest building in the world and living in shanties in the parking lot, and yet sending money home to their families. And all of the things that are black and white in textbooks come alive when you're in real settings, experiencing other cultures. And it was that moment that I came home after a number of these trips and asked the provost for a committee. And he said, I don't have a committee, but I have an administrative job for you. And so I did that for a year, and then that led to thinking that I like thinking systemically about how do we create transformational learning opportunities for all students. And in winter of 2020, somebody put my name in for this job, and I applied, and I think it was just a perfect a value match. And I don't, I'm happy here, just trying to do the right thing at the right moment for this really odd and in some ways challenging and in some ways exciting time in our country.
That's wonderful. and very inspiring. Thank you for sharing that. Um, Michelle, Chancellor Marks, this has been a fascinating hour learning from you. Thank you so much for the time that you have granted us. I know that everyone who's been on the call today learned a ton from you. And I hope that we get to reconnect again in the future.
We definitely will. Thank you so much, Farouk. I follow you as well. I'm incredibly impressed with your work, and you are serving as a model and a guide and an inspiration for so many of us.
You are very gracious. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I want to thank everyone who tuned in today. And as I always say, the only vision that matters is the one that you create. Thank you all. See you next time.